November 22nd, 1943. 43 nautical miles northeast of Bougainville, Solomon Islands, Vice Admiral Sentaro Omori's cruiser force intercepts what appears to be an isolated American convoy. 6 Liberty ships, 2 tankers, minimal escort. Through the pre-dawn darkness, his flagship Sendai's lookouts count only 3 destroyers protecting the merchantman. For a Japanese navy that has watched its supply lines strangle month by month, this represents an extraordinary opportunity. His intelligence officer estimates the convoy carries perhaps 80,000 tons of cargo, enough supplies to sustain forward garrisons for 2 months, enough fuel to keep his cruisers operational through the coming Rabaul defense. His staff calculates interception geometry while American escorts maneuver to screen their charges. But something troubles Omori. As he studies the convoy's formation through his binoculars, the merchantmen show no panic, no emergency turns, no distress signals lighting up the radio spectrum. They maintain course and speed as if his cruiser force, 4 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, representing Japan's remaining surface strength in the region, poses no threat worth acknowledging. The Americans sail northwest toward Guadalcanal as though his guns do not exist. His operations officer approaches with intercept calculations. Admiral, we can close to gun range within 90 minutes. The escorts are Fletcher-class destroyers, dangerous but outnumbered. The merchantmen are undefended. We can take them all. Omori nods slowly, still watching the convoy's steady progress. Something about their confidence disturbs him at a level he cannot articulate. American convoys have learned caution since 1942. They scatter when threatened. They call for air support. They sacrifice escorts to save cargo ships carrying irreplaceable supplies. This convoy does none of those things. It simply sails onward as if his cruisers represent a minor inconvenience rather than overwhelming force. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Order the attack, Omori commands, but maintain readiness for airstrikes. This feels wrong. His force accelerates to 28 knots, closing the distance while maintaining battle formation. The American destroyers finally react, turning to meet his advance with the aggressive posture he has learned to expect from U.S. Navy surface combatants. But the merchantmen continue northwest. Still no scatter, still no distress, calls that his radio operators can detect. The first destroyer launches torpedoes at maximum range. Omori's flagship turns hard to comb the tracks, while his heavy cruisers open fire at 16,000 meters. 8-inch shells bracket the American destroyer, forcing it to retreat behind smoke screens. The second destroyer presses closer, firing with its 5-inch guns, while launching its own torpedo spread. Omori's force splits to avoid the threat, his cruisers maneuvering with the practiced coordination that has kept them alive through 2 years of night surface actions. But something happens that Omori has never witnessed in his 32 years of naval service. As his cruisers pursue the destroyers, more American vessels appear on the horizon. Not reinforcements, not combat ships, more merchants. 12 additional Liberty ships steamed in loose formation, escorted by 4 more destroyers. Then his radar operator reports another group. 18 contacts, bearing 340, range 22,000 meters. Omori climbs to the navigation bridge, studying the tactical plot his staff has assembled. The 6 ships he initially detected represent not an isolated convoy, but the trailing element of something far larger. His intelligence officer counts contacts on the radar plot, his voice tight with disbelief. Admiral, I make 41 merchant vessels, minimum 14,000 tons displacement each. That represents, he pauses, recalculating, 574,000 tons of cargo. In a single convoy. The mathematics stagger Omori. Japan's entire remaining tanker fleet totals perhaps 800,000 tons, stretched across the Pacific, Indian Ocean, and home waters, and the Americans have assembled nearly that much cargo capacity in one Convoy, sailing through contested waters as casually as a peacetime trade route. His mind calculates implications, while his cruisers continue engaging the American escorts. Then, the radio operator receives a transmission that changes everything. American aircraft inbound, bearing 090, range 60 kilometers. Multiple contacts. His air search radar confirms it. Dozens of aircraft, probably from Guadalcanal's airfields, summoned by the convoy escorts he thought were isolated. The tactical situation inverts instantly. His cruiser force, powerful enough to annihilate the merchantman, becomes prey to aircraft that can attack from altitudes his anti-aircraft guns cannot reach effectively. "Admiral, we should withdraw," his operations officer says, quietly. "We achieved reconnaissance. We documented their strength. But if we remain, those aircraft will find us at dawn." Omori knows the arithmetic of naval aviation versus surface ships without air cover. He has watched it kill too many vessels these past 18 months, but something compels him to ask a different question. "How many convoys?" he says. His staff looks confused. "How many convoys of this size?" he clarifies. "If this represents 500,000 tons, and they are supplying Guadalcanal, which intelligence estimates receive 2 million tons annually, then they are running these convoys." He performs the division 4 times per month. Minimum. Every week, a convoy this size. The silence on the bridge stretches while his officers process the implications. Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto, his logistics officer, speaks first. "Admiral, if they are moving 500,000 tons weekly to Guadalcanal, their total Pacific supply tonnage exceeds—" He trails off, unable or unwilling to complete the calculation. "Exceeds Japan's entire merchant fleet capacity," Omori finishes, "by a factor of 3, perhaps 4. He lowers his binoculars. "Order withdrawal. Increase speed to 30 knots. We will document what we saw and file a complete report with the combined fleet. Whether anyone reads it is another matter." His cruisers disengage, laying smoke while turning south toward Rabaul. Behind them, the American convoy continues its steady progress northwest. No pursuit, no change in formation. The merchantmen sail onward as if the engagement never occurred, as if Japanese cruisers represent no threat worth acknowledging, because the supplies they carry will be replaced next week by another convoy of identical size. Omori retires to his sea cabin and begins drafting the preliminary report, but the numbers defeat him. Every calculation produces results too large to be credible. If the Americans run weekly convoys of 500,000 tons to Guadalcanal alone, and they occupy dozens of island bases across the Pacific, then their total supply capacity reaches figures that make Japan's strategic position not merely difficult, but mathematically impossible. He finds his answer in a message intercepted by his intelligence staff captured 3 weeks earlier. An American logistics officer requesting replacement supplies for Guadalcanal. The requisition listed items with casual abundance that had seemed like propaganda at the time. 10,000 tons of fresh food, 15,000 tons of ammunition, 8,000 tons of construction materials, weekly allocation, routine resupply. Routine resupply. The same phrase he had seen on the Liberty ship manifest his colleague, Vice Admiral Kurita, had documented last month. The Americans treated 500,000 tons as routine. They built ships faster than Japan could sink them, trained pilots faster than combat could kill them, and produced supplies in quantities that turned warfare from a contest of skill into an arithmetic problem with only one solution. Omori looks at the convoy size chart his staff has assembled. 41 vessels, 574,000 tons, weekly frequency, multiply by 52 weeks. The annual figure exceeds 29 million tons to one island base. Japan's entire war economy, stretched across 4 years of conflict, had failed to produce half that tonnage for all purposes combined. The Americans were not winning through superior tactics or better training. They were winning through mathematics so overwhelming that Japanese courage became irrelevant. One could not fight production ratios with fighting spirit. One could not defeat logistics with honor. The abacus did not care about warrior culture or noble sacrifice. It simply added and subtracted until the answer became unavoidable. Japan had already lost a war. It thought it was still fighting. The convoy, sailing past his cruisers, represented proof sailing at 12 knots through waters Japan claimed to control. And next week, another convoy would follow. And the week after that, an industrial tide that did not stop, did not slow, did not tire. It simply delivered supplies in quantities that made tactical victories meaningless. His report to the combined fleet would document what he had witnessed. The convoy size, the escort strength, the speed with which American aircraft responded to threats against their supply lines, whether anyone in Tokyo would acknowledge the implications, remained uncertain, but the evidence would exist. When historians examined how Japan lost the Pacific War, they would find Omori's report and understand that some officers had recognized the mathematical impossibility of victory months before the final collapse. The Sendai increased speed to 32 knots, racing south toward Rabaul before American aircraft could locate his force. Behind them, 41 merchantmen continued northwest, carrying 500,000 tons of supplies that would be unloaded, distributed, and replaced next week by an identical convoy. The arithmetic of industrial warfare, as implacable as ocean currents, and just as impossible to resist through courage alone. Admiral Sentaro Omori's cruiser force reached Rabaul's Simpson Harbor at 1400 hours on November the 23rd, 1943. The anchorage held perhaps 30 vessels, representing the combined remnants of Japanese naval and merchant strength in the South Pacific. Cruisers damaged in previous engagements, awaiting parts that would never arrive. Destroyers nursing mechanical failures that shore facilities lacked resources to repair. Tankers that had survived the submarine gauntlet from the Dutch East Indies, their precious fuel already allocated to operations that consumed oil faster than the supply chain could deliver it. Omori drafted his report that evening in the flag quarters overlooking the harbor. Through his window, he watched work parties transferring supplies from a transport that had arrived 3 days earlier. The unloading proceeded slowly, manually, because the harbor's cargo handling equipment had been destroyed in an American air raid 2 weeks prior. Every crate moved by hand, every drum of fuel rolled across gangplanks by sailors who should have been training for combat operations instead of performing stevedore labor. His report ran to 18 pages when completed. The first section documented the tactical engagement, times, bearings, ranges, weapon expenditures, standard after-action format that any naval staff officer could process without difficulty. But the second section, titled Logistics Assessment and Strategic Implications, contained observations that Omori knew would be filed away and forgotten. He described the convoy's composition in detail. 41. Merchant vessels, each approximately 14,000 tons displacement based on visual estimation and radar contacts, formation discipline, suggesting experienced crews and reliable vessels rather than hastily assembled merchantmen. Escort strength of 7 destroyers, adequate for routine protection but insufficient for heavily contested waters, suggesting American confidence that air cover could respond rapidly to any surface threat. The mathematics appeared in the third section. 41 vessels at 14,000 tons, each equals 574,000 tons of cargo capacity. Weekly convoy frequency, based on intelligence estimates of Guadalcanal supply requirements, equals 29 million tons annually to one base. The Japanese merchant fleet's total remaining capacity is approximately 4 million tons across all theaters and purposes, declining monthly as submarines sink vessels faster than shipyards can replace them. Ratio 7-1. Omori stared at that number. The Americans were moving 7 times Japan's total remaining merchant capacity to a single island base they had captured 14 months earlier. He performed the calculation again, checking for errors. The numbers remained unchanged, 7-1, and that calculation assumed the Americans dedicated their entire Pacific supply effort to Guadalcanal alone, which seemed absurd given their simultaneous operations across New Guinea, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and dozens of other locations. Lieutenant Commander Hashimoto entered with additional intelligence summaries that had arrived during their return voyage. Admiral, you should see these. Port facility assessments from our reconnaissance aircraft. He spread aerial photographs across the desk. Espiritu Santo, photographed November 18th. Hashimoto pointed to ships anchored in formations so dense they overlapped in the image. I count 73 vessels, possibly more obscured by the resolution. Omori studied the photograph with a magnifying glass. The harbor looked like Tokyo Bay during peacetime naval reviews. Ships everywhere. Tankers, transports, auxiliaries, warships, an entire fleet's worth of vessels concentrated in a single anchorage, 8,000 nautical miles from the American west coast. He picked up the next photograph. Noumea, November 20th. Same pattern. 68 vessels visible. The intelligence officer has compiled supply estimates based on these assessments. Hashimoto continued. He calculates American supply stocks in the South Pacific alone exceed 4 million tons. That represents our entire merchant fleet capacity stored in forward bases as reserve supplies. He paused. Admiral, they have enough supplies forward deployed that they could sustain operations for 6 months if every supply ship stopped sailing today. Omori set down the photographs and walked to the window. In the harbor below, the work party was still unloading the transport. They had been working for 3 days and appeared perhaps 40% complete. That single ship carried maybe 5,000 tons. The Americans had 4 million tons in forward stocks, 800 times what that transport contained. The scale defied comprehension. Has anyone else filed reports documenting these observations? Omori asked. Hashimoto consulted his files. Vice Admiral Kurita submitted extensive documentation last month after capturing a Liberty ship. Admiral Tanaka has reported on American supply abundance in captured positions. Commander Nakano filed intelligence assessments on American merchant construction rates. Several submarine commanders have noted the density of American convoy traffic. So, the information exists, Omori said. Combined fleet has access to data showing American supply capacity exceeds ours by factors of 5, 7, perhaps 10 to 1. Hashimoto nodded carefully. The information exists, Admiral. Whether it reaches decision-makers, whether it influences strategy, that remains unclear. The institutional preference appears to favor reports confirming our doctrine rather than challenging our assumptions. Omori completed his report with a final section titled Recommendations. He knew these recommendations would be ignored, but documentation mattered. Future historians would need to understand that some officers had recognized the mathematical impossibility of victory and had attempted to communicate that recognition through proper channels. Recommendation 1. Conduct comprehensive assessment of American merchant construction capacity and supply chain logistics. Current intelligence appears to significantly underestimate enemy industrial production. Recommendation 2. Revise strategic assumptions regarding sustainable defensive operations. Current doctrine assumes American forces will exhaust their supply capacity through prolonged campaigns. Evidence suggests the inverse. American supply capacity increases while Japanese capacity diminishes. Recommendation 3. Evaluate alternative strategic approaches to current conflict. If material disparity exceeds the threshold where tactical excellence can compensate, continuation of current operational tempo serves no strategic purpose and wastes irreplaceable resources. That final recommendation bordered on defeatism. Omori knew it, but mathematics did not care about defeatism. The abacus did not calculate morale or fighting spirit. It simply added American supply tonnage and subtracted Japanese capacity until the answer became unavoidable. He filed the report through proper channels on November 25, 1943. The acknowledgement of receipt arrived from Combined Fleet Headquarters on November 28th. No questions, no requests for clarification, no orders to provide additional details. The report disappeared into Tokyo's filing system as if it had never existed. But Omori was not alone in his observations. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, reports accumulated from multiple sources documenting American supply abundance that contradicted every pre-war assumption about enemy industrial capacity. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding surface forces in the Philippines, submitted intelligence assessments documenting American base development that proceeded at rates Japanese engineers considered impossible, airfield construction that transformed coral atolls into operational bases within weeks, harbor facilities built from prefabricated components that arrived on specialized ships designed specifically for rapid logistics infrastructure, fuel storage tanks that appeared overnight, already filled with aviation gasoline and diesel fuel. Kurita's civil engineering officer calculated that American construction rates exceeded Japanese capability by factors approaching 20 to 1. The submarine force provided perhaps the most comprehensive intelligence on American maritime activity. Japanese submarines operating along supply routes from Hawaii to forward bases reported convoy densities that suggested continuous shipping traffic rather than periodic supply runs. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, commanding I-58, filed reports documenting convoy compositions that routinely exceeded 30 vessels. His patrol reports noted that American merchant ships appeared to be new construction, not requisitioned civilian vessels, suggesting dedicated wartime shipbuilding programs of enormous scale. American air superiority made convoy interception increasingly difficult throughout 1944. Japanese submarines that once operated with relative freedom found themselves hunted by destroyer escorts equipped with sonar systems that could detect submarines at ranges exceeding Japanese torpedo range. Long-range patrol aircraft forced submarines to remain submerged during daylight hours, reducing their ability to intercept convoys and limiting their operational effectiveness to opportunistic night attacks against targets that rarely appeared. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intelligence picture that emerged from these accumulated reports painted a comprehensive portrait of American logistics that far exceeded pre-war Japanese assessments. American merchant construction appeared to exceed 1,000 vessels annually. Port capacity in forward bases matched or exceeded major Japanese civilian harbors. Supply stockpiles forward deployed in the Pacific represented more tonnage than Japan's entire industrial output for 1942 and 1943 combined. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving on the combined fleet operations staff, attempted to compile these scattered reports into a comprehensive logistics assessment during January 1944. His assignment from Admiral Minichi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, was to evaluate whether American supply lines represented a strategic vulnerability that Japanese forces could exploit. Oi spent 6 weeks reviewing intelligence reports, interrogating captured American personnel, and analyzing reconnaissance photographs of enemy bases. His final assessment ran to 47 pages with 63 supporting appendices. The conclusion contradicted his assignment's underlying assumption. American supply lines did not represent a vulnerability. They represented an industrial capacity so overwhelming that Japanese forces lacked the resources to meaningfully disrupt them. OI's report documented that American merchant construction exceeded Japanese estimates by factors of 3 to 5. The Liberty ship program alone produced approximately 2,000 vessels by the end of 1943, with production rates accelerating through 1944. Each Liberty ship carried 14,000 tons of cargo and was being built in construction times averaging 45 days from keel laying to launch. Japanese merchant construction, by contrast, produced approximately 800 vessels between 1942 and 1943, with construction times averaging 8 months per vessel. The disparity in construction rates meant that American replacement capacity exceeded Japanese interdiction capability by unsustainable margins. Japanese submarines sank approximately 300 Allied merchant vessels in 1943. American shipyards launched over 2,000 vessels during the same period. The mathematics was brutally simple. Japan was sinking one ship for every 7 the Americans built. At that rate, American merchant capacity would continue growing regardless of Japanese submarine effectiveness. Admiral Koga read Oi's report during February 1944 while planning the defense of the Mariana Islands. The assessment confirmed what many senior officers privately understood but could not officially acknowledge. Japan was fighting an opponent whose industrial capacity made prolonged warfare unwinnable. Every tactical victory consumed irreplaceable resources, while American forces simply requisitioned replacements from production systems that treated losses as acceptable costs rather than strategic disasters. Koga died in a plane crash on March 31, 1944, before he could implement strategic changes based on Oi's assessment. His replacement, Admiral Somu Toyoda, inherited responsibility for defending the Marianas against American forces that now deployed more combat power in a single carrier task group than Japan possessed in its entire remaining combined fleet. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the futility of Japanese attempts to achieve tactical victory against opponents supported by logistics systems that operated on incomprehensible scales. American carrier task forces operated continuously for weeks without returning to port, sustained by fleet oilers that conducted underway replenishment at sea. Japanese carriers, by contrast, required port visits every 2 weeks for fuel and provisions because the Imperial Navy lacked dedicated replenishment vessels in sufficient numbers. American aircraft losses during the Philippine Sea engagement, approximately 123 planes, were replaced within days by reserve aircraft flown from escort carriers specifically designated for aircraft transport. Japanese losses, approximately 450 aircraft, represented irreplaceable combat power that would take months to regenerate if replacement aircraft could even be produced, given Japan's declining industrial capacity. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet limped back to Japanese waters with 3 carriers sunk and most of its experienced pilots dead. American Task Force 58 continued operations without interruption. The disparity in logistics sustainability meant that American forces grew stronger as campaigns progressed, while Japanese forces became progressively weaker, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. Omori received orders in July 1944 to attend a conference at Yokosuka Naval Base. The topic was defensive preparations for the expected American assault on the Philippines. 27 flag officers assembled in a conference room overlooking Tokyo Bay, reviewing operational plans that assumed Japanese forces could achieve decisive victory through superior tactics and aggressive offensive spirit. The briefings detailed how the combined fleet would concentrate remaining carrier air power for one final battle that would blunt American offensive momentum and create conditions for negotiated settlement. The plan required perfect coordination, favorable weather, and American commanders making tactical errors that would expose their carriers to Japanese attack. Omori listened to the briefings and calculated the odds of everything aligning as planned. The percentage was so small, it effectively rounded to 0. During a break between sessions, Omori found himself standing with several other squadron commanders near the windows overlooking the harbor. The view should have shown a powerful fleet preparing for decisive battle. Instead, they observed perhaps 30 vessels total, many showing visible damage from previous engagements, others clearly immobilized by mechanical failures or fuel shortages. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Shigur, spoke quietly. I commanded a destroyer division at Guadalcanal, 8 ships. We fought for 15 months, sinking American vessels, disrupting their supply lines, executing perfect night torpedo attacks. We thought we were winning through tactical excellence. He gestured at the harbor. I have 1 ship left. The Americans have more destroyers operating in the Pacific today than they had when the war started. We won every engagement and lost the campaign because they simply built replacements faster than we could sink them. The meeting resumed with operational assignments. Omori would command a cruiser force tasked with engaging American invasion transports during the Philippines landings. His mission statement emphasized inflicting maximum casualties and disrupting enemy timetables. The briefing officer did not mention that American timetables included built-in delays accounting for Japanese resistance. The invasion schedules assumed opposition and had already allocated time for overwhelming it through material superiority. Omori returned to Rabaul in early August 1944 and found his flagship, Sendai, scheduled for refit that would require 6 weeks to complete if parts could be sourced from increasingly strained supply chains. The delay meant missing the initial Philippines operations, but potentially participating in subsequent defensive battles as American forces advanced toward Japan's inner defense perimeter. He used the time to compile a supplementary intelligence assessment building on his November Convoy report. This expanded version incorporated data from multiple sources, including WWII's comprehensive logistics study, submarine patrol reports, and reconnaissance photography showing American base development throughout the Pacific. The document's central argument rested on mathematical analysis rather than tactical assessment. Omori calculated that American supply tonnage reaching forward Pacific bases exceeded 8 million tons through the first half of 1944. That figure represented more than Japan's total merchant fleet capacity at the war's beginning. The Americans were moving more supplies in 6 months than Japan's entire maritime infrastructure could transport under optimal conditions. More critically, the supply tonnage continued increasing. American merchant construction rates suggested that 1944 production would exceed 3,000 vessels, even assuming generous Japanese submarine effectiveness of 400 sinkings annually. American merchant capacity would grow by approximately 2,600 vessels or 36 million tons of additional cargo capacity. Japan's merchant fleet, by contrast, was shrinking monthly as losses exceeded replacement construction by ratios approaching 3-to-1. The strategic implications appeared in Omori's final section, titled Assessment of Sustainable Operations. His conclusion was mathematically rigorous and strategically devastating. Japanese forces could not sustain current operational tempo beyond mid-1945, regardless of tactical performance. Supply shortages would ground aircraft, immobilize naval vessels, and starve forward garrisons before American forces needed to assault them. He filed this supplementary report through the same channels as his original assessment. The response was identical. Acknowledgement of receipt. No questions. No engagement with the analysis. The institutional, machinery processed uncomfortable truths by filing them away where they could be safely ignored. September 1944 brought intelligence reports that American forces had invaded Peleliu in the Palau Islands, bypassing Rabaul entirely. The garrison that Omori's cruiser force had been defending with its presence would remain isolated, cut off from supply, left to slowly exhaust its resources while American forces advanced past them toward the Philippines. The bypassing strategy represented another dimension of American material superiority. They possessed sufficient forces to simply ignore Japanese strongpoints, leaving them to wither while advancing along axes where resistance could be overwhelmed. Through logistic superiority, Admiral Toyoda's orders for the Philippines defense arrived in October. Omori would command center force surface units, including battleships Yamato and Musashi, plus heavy cruisers and destroyers. The operation aimed to destroy American invasion transports and achieve decisive surface engagement that would validate Japanese tactical doctrine one final time. Omori read the operation order and understood he was being sent to execute a plan that mathematics had already proven impossible. But orders were orders, duty was duty, and perhaps some truths could only be learned through experience, rather than calculation. The abacus said they had already lost. The battleships would sail anyway. October 23rd, 1944. Center Force entered the Sibuyan Sea under clear skies that offered no protection from American carrier aircraft. Omori stood on Sendai's bridge, watching the massive silhouette of Musashi leading the formation. The battleship displaced 72,000 tons, mounted 9 18-inch guns, and represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. Her armor could theoretically withstand any weapon in the American arsenal. The first American aircraft appeared at 10:30 hours, Grumman Hellcats and Avengers from Task Group 38.3. Omori counted approximately 60 aircraft in the initial wave, attacking with coordination that spoke to extensive training and combat experience. The formation split, some aircraft drawing anti-aircraft fire while torpedo bombers approached from multiple vectors simultaneously. Musashi's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with exploding shells that destroyed 3 American aircraft in the first minutes. But more kept coming, wave after wave. The attacks continued through the afternoon, with fresh aircraft replacing losses so quickly that Omori realized he was watching a logistics demonstration rather than a tactical battle. By 1400 hours, Musashi had absorbed 11 torpedo hits and 8 bomb strikes. Her speed had dropped to 16 knots. Her forward turret was disabled, but she remained afloat, testament to her designer's skill. The American attacks continued without pause. More aircraft arrived every 90 minutes, perfectly timed rotations that suggested carrier task forces coordinating strikes through radio networks that allowed them to concentrate aircraft from multiple carriers against single targets. At 15:30 hours, Musashi's temperature reached 13 degrees. Emergency pumping systems struggled against flooding that overwhelmed damage control capabilities. At 16:45, the battleship's captain gave the order to abandon ship. Omori watched through binoculars as Musashi's bow rose slowly, her stern sinking beneath the waves. The massive warship slid beneath the surface at 19:15 hours, taking over 1,000 crew with her. The Americans had sunk the world's most powerful battleship through overwhelming numerical superiority rather than tactical brilliance. Omori counted approximately 200 aircraft participating in the day's attacks. Intelligence had estimated American carrier strength at 16 fleet carriers plus dozens of escort carriers. 200 aircraft represented perhaps 20% of their available air power. They had destroyed Musashi while barely tapping their total capacity. Center force continued through San Bernardino Strait during the night hours, emerging into Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th. Omori's staff reported American escort carriers ahead, 6 CVEs with destroyer escorts, light opposition. The invasion transports lay beyond, vulnerable to surface attack. The mission could still succeed. His cruisers engaged at 23,000 meters, his 8-inch guns finding range against the American carriers. One escort carrier, Gambier Bay, absorbed multiple hits and began listing. American destroyers charged his formation with suicidal courage, launching torpedoes and firing their 5-inch guns against cruisers that outweighed them by factors of 10 to 1. Omori watched the American destroyers press their attacks even as his cruisers' guns tore them apart. USS Johnston continued firing until her magazines exploded. USS Hull maintained torpedo attacks until she capsized from battle damage. The destroyers bought time for their carriers to launch aircraft and transmit distress signals. They bought time through sacrifice that Omori recognized as tactically sound because American doctrine could afford such losses. Within 30 minutes of the engagement's start, American aircraft arrived from carriers beyond the horizon. Not the escort carriers under attack, but fleet carriers from Task Force 38. Dozens of aircraft, then hundreds. The sky filled with Hellcats and Avengers that attacked his cruisers with the same methodical coordination he had witnessed in the Sibuyan Sea. At 08:55 hours, Omori made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. He ordered general withdrawal. His staff stared in disbelief. The enemy was before them. Escort carriers burning, transports vulnerable, victory within reach. Why retreat? Because Omori understood what none of his staff officers had yet grasped. Tactical victory was meaningless against an opponent whose industrial capacity could replace every ship he sank by next month. He could destroy every American vessel in Leyte Gulf and achieve nothing of strategic value, because more would arrive next week and the week after. The Americans would simply requisition replacements from shipyards that had already built the vessels and were waiting for authorization to dispatch them. The mathematics permitted no other conclusion. Japan had already lost this war through industrial disparity, so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant. Fighting accomplished nothing except killing sailors who could not be replaced while destroying ships Japan could not rebuild. Omori ordered retreat not from cowardice but from recognition that courage without purpose was waste. Center Force withdrew through the San Bernardino Strait under continuous air attack. American aircraft pursued them throughout the day, sinking 2 more cruisers before breaking off at nightfall. Omori's force limped back to Brunei Bay with 40% casualties and accomplished nothing of strategic value. The Americans landed on Leyte on schedule, their timetables undisrupted, their supply lines unthreatened. Admiral Toyoda's inquiry regarding the premature withdrawal arrived 3 days later. Omori drafted his response with care, knowing it would likely end his career. He explained the tactical situation accurately. Enemy carriers beyond engagement range, continuous air attacks that would have destroyed remaining forces without corresponding American losses. Withdrawal preserved combat capability for future operations. But he added a final paragraph that transformed his after-action report into something approaching dissent. The strategic situation requires reassessment. American material superiority has reached levels where tactical excellence cannot compensate. Recommendation: evaluate whether continued offensive operations serve strategic purpose or merely consume irreplaceable resources in pursuit of objectives that enemy industrial capacity has rendered unattainable. The response from Combined Fleet Headquarters came within 48 hours. Vice Admiral Omori was relieved of operational command and reassigned to administrative duties at Yokosuka Naval Base. His service record would note that he withdrew from engagement with the enemy when tactical situations favored offensive action. The implication was clear. His career was finished. Omori accepted the reassignment without protest. He had spoken truth that the institution could not acknowledge without repudiating itself. The Imperial Navy's doctrine rested on offensive spirit and faith that tactical excellence overcame material disadvantage. Admitting that doctrine had become obsolete would destroy institutional identity at precisely the moment when maintaining morale required projecting absolute confidence. He reported to Yokosuka in early November 1944 and found himself assigned to logistics planning staff. The irony was not lost on him. The officer, who had documented American logistics superiority, now faced daily exposure to Japanese supply failures that confirmed every assessment he had filed. The logistics situation was catastrophic. Fuel allocations for November had been cut by 30% because submarine losses exceeded tanker replacement rates. Aircraft production faced raw material shortages that would reduce output by 40% through the first quarter 1945. Food supplies for naval personnel would be reduced to 1,800 calories per day because merchant shipping could no longer sustain current allocation rates. Meanwhile, intelligence reports documented American logistics that continued expanding. Reconnaissance photographs showed Ulithi Atoll transformed into a massive forward base with hundreds of vessels anchored in a lagoon that had been an empty jungle 18 months earlier. Supply estimates calculated American forward stocks now exceeded 12 million tons. Their logistics infrastructure had become self-sustaining, requiring minimal resupply from the United States because forward bases possessed repair facilities, fuel refineries, and even ice cream production plants. Ice cream. Omori read that intelligence report 3 times. The Americans had built ice cream factories on forward bases 8,000 miles from California. They were producing frozen desserts for their sailors, while Japanese naval personnel faced calorie restrictions that would leave them malnourished by spring. The disparity transcended military capability and entered the realm of civilizational differences so profound that warfare between such opponents could have only one outcome. December 1944 brought the American invasion of Mindoro in the Philippines. Japanese forces mounted kamikaze attacks that sank several vessels and damaged others, but the invasion proceeded on schedule. American logistics absorbed the losses without operational impact. Replacement ships arrived within days. The damaged vessels were either repaired by forward maintenance units or towed to rear bases where specialized repair ships could restore them to service without returning to the United States. Admiral Toyoda convened a final strategic conference in January 1945 to plan homeland defense. The attendees included every remaining flag officer with operational experience. Omori attended as a logistics staff officer rather than a combat commander, sitting in the back of the conference room while senior officers discussed defensive preparations. The briefings detailed how remaining naval forces would be concentrated for Operation Tengo, a final surface action aimed at disrupting the expected American invasion of Okinawa. The plan called for Yamato, Japan's last operational battleship, to sail toward Okinawa with minimal escort, engage American invasion forces, and beach herself to serve as an unsinkable artillery platform. The operation was explicitly described as a one-way mission. Fuel allocations provided sufficient oil to reach Okinawa, but not to return. Omori listened to the briefing with growing horror. They were planning to send Yamato and 3,000 sailors on a suicide mission that operational analysis estimated had less than 5% probability of reaching the target. American carrier aircraft would intercept the force long before it reached Okinawa. The battleship would be sunk with all hands, accomplishing nothing except demonstrating Japanese willingness to sacrifice lives for symbolic gestures. During the question period following the briefing, Omori rose from his seat in the back row. Admiral, permission to speak regarding logistics implications. Toyoda nodded permission. Omori chose his words carefully. The operation, as briefed, requires approximately 4,000 tons of fuel oil. Current allocations reserve that quantity for defensive operations, protecting homeland approaches. Diverting fuel to Operation Tengo reduces defensive capability by approximately 20% for the month of April. The operations officer responded before Toyoda could speak. The symbolic value of Yamato, engaging the enemy, justifies reduced defensive capacity. Morale considerations require demonstrating offensive spirit even when material circumstances limit tactical options. Omori had expected this response. He pressed forward anyway. I respectfully submit that morale considerations should be balanced against operational effectiveness. 3,000 sailors and 4,000 tons of fuel oil represent resources that could sustain defensive operations for several weeks. The one-way nature of this mission ensures those resources will be expended without corresponding American losses. At the conference room, fell silent. Several officers stared at Omori with expressions ranging from shock to anger. He had violated unspoken protocol by implicitly questioning whether symbolic gestures served strategic purposes. Admiral Toyoda studied him for a long moment before responding. Your logistics concerns are noted. However, there are considerations beyond material calculations. The spirit of the attack matters as much as its tactical outcome. Dismissed. Omori sat down, knowing he had accomplished nothing except confirming his reputation as an officer who placed mathematical analysis above fighting spirit. But he had spoken for the record. When historians examined how Japan had squandered its remaining resources on suicide missions, they would find Omori's objection documented in the conference minutes. Operation Tengo launched on April 6, 1945. Yamato sailed from the inland sea with light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. American submarines detected the force before it cleared Japanese coastal waters. Carrier aircraft from Task. Force 58 intercepted Yamato 200 miles southwest of Kyushu on April 7th. The attacks began at 12:30 hours and continued for 2 hours. Omori monitored radio reports from Yokosuka, listening as Yamato's communications officer reported hit after hit. The battleship absorbed 10 torpedo strikes and 5 bomb hits before her magazines detonated at 14:23 hours. She sank in minutes, taking 2,743 sailors with her. The Americans lost 10 aircraft. Omori drafted the casualty notifications that evening. 2,743 families to be informed that their sons or husbands or fathers had died in an operation that accomplished no tactical objective and served no strategic purpose except demonstrating that Japan retained the will to sacrifice lives even when those sacrifices achieved nothing. He thought of the convoy he had intercepted 17 months earlier. 41 vessels carrying 500,000 tons of supplies, weekly convoys, continuous logistics. The Americans had transformed warfare into an industrial process where combat became a supply chain management problem rather than a contest between warriors. Japan had fought with courage and skill and honor and lost anyway because the abacus did not calculate courage. The war ended on August 15th, 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. Omori listened to the broadcast from his office at Yokosuka. The emperor's voice, thin and uncertain, explained that the war situation had not developed to Japan's advantage. The understatement was so profound it bordered on absurdity. The war situation had been mathematically unwinnable since 1943. Everything since then had been institutional momentum, carrying Japan toward inevitable defeat while consuming lives that could not be replaced. The American occupation forces arrived in Tokyo Bay on August 28th. Omori stood at attention on the dock at Yokosuka as American ships entered the harbor. He counted vessels almost reflexively, 37 warships visible from his position, dozens more beyond the horizon, an entire fleet sailing into what had been Japan's most important naval base, as if they owned it, because they did own it. Industrial superiority was so overwhelming that Japanese resistance had become meaningless. One American officer, a naval logistics commander named William Callahan, came ashore to coordinate port facility assessments. Omori was assigned as his liaison, given his logistics planning experience. They toured Yokosuka's empty warehouses and rusting equipment together. "Your facilities are impressive," Callahan said, examining a dry dock large enough to accommodate battleships. "Excellent engineering." Omori nodded politely, but insufficient industrial capacity to sustain them. "Your supply chain defeated us more decisively than your weapons." Callahan looked at him thoughtfully. "You understood this during the war?" "I filed reports," Omori replied. "November 1943, after intercepting a convoy, I documented that your supply tonnage exceeded our capacity by factors that made continued resistance mathematically futile." "Did anyone read them?" Callahan asked. Omori smiled without humor. "They were acknowledged, filed, ignored. Some truths threaten institutional identity too profoundly to be accepted, even when survival requires it." Callahan pulled out a notebook and showed Omori production statistics. Final American merchant construction through August 1945, 5,777 vessels. Total displacement, approximately 60 million tons. Peak monthly production in December 1943. 317 ships. We were building a ship every 4.6 hours by the end of 1943. Omori studied the numbers in silence. 60 million tons. Japan's entire merchant fleet at the war's beginning had totaled approximately 6 million tons. The Americans had built 10 times Japan's starting capacity during the war. The mathematics was so overwhelming, it transcended military analysis and became a study in civilizational differences that Japan's leadership had failed to comprehend. "What will you do now?" Callahan asked. "The war is over. Japan must rebuild." Omori looked out at the harbor filled with American vessels. "I will document what I observed. Write a comprehensive account of how we failed to understand industrial warfare. Perhaps future generations can learn from our mistakes. We fought with courage. We died with honor. And we lost anyway, because we miscalculated the nature of modern warfare so completely that our bravery became irrelevant." Callahan extended his hand. "That's a worthy task. History should know the truth. Both sides' truths." Omori shook hands with the American officer and felt the weight of 3,000 years of Japanese military tradition colliding with the reality of 20th century industrial warfare. Honor and courage mattered, but they could not defeat production lines that built ships faster than warriors could sink them. He spent the remaining years of his life writing a comprehensive account of Japan's logistics failures during the Pacific War. The manuscript ran to 870 pages, documenting every report he had filed, every observation he had made, every calculation showing that Japan had already lost a war it thought it was still fighting. The book was published in 1953 under the title The Mathematics of Defeat, Industrial Warfare, and the Limits of Courage. In his final chapter, Omori returned to the convoy he had intercepted in November 1943. 41 vessels, 574,000 tons, weekly resupply. The image that had crystallized his understanding that Japan was fighting not an enemy fleet, but an industrial system so vast that tactical victories became meaningless. Wrote, "We counted their ships at anchor and thought we understood their strength. We failed to count their shipyards, their steel mills, their factories producing rivets and welding equipment and engine components. We measured military power by warships deployed rather than industrial capacity available for deployment. That error cost 3 million Japanese lives and condemned our nation to defeat that mathematics had already rendered certain by 1943. The convoy continued sailing through Omori's memory long after the war ended. 41 ships proceeding northwest toward Guadalcanal, as if Japanese cruisers represented no threat worth acknowledging. Because to those ships, to the industrial system they represented, Japanese tactical superiority was irrelevant. They would reach Guadalcanal on schedule. They would unload their supplies. Next week, another convoy would follow. And the week after that, an industrial tide that did not stop, did not slow, did not tire. It simply delivered supplies in quantities that turned warfare from a contest of warriors into an arithmetic problem with only one solution. Omori died in 1968, 23 years after the war's end. His final words, reported by his daughter, were in English, a language he had studied during the occupation. "The abacus was right," he whispered. "It was always right. We should have listened to mathematics instead of courage." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.